What's up, brothers and sisters? Welcome to part 2. You know I love dealing with the facts. Real history over fake history, you feel me? So here's the deal. My new segment is called 5 Minutes of Facts. Sit back and relax and let's give them this work. I'm gonna do a recap for my hardhead followers who didn't go to part 2 when I told you in part 1 it was already up. Let's get it. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Here are 3 things he covered in part 1. 1. Residential segregation was not happenstance. It was not something we decided to do because we were comfortable with our own kind. It was a systemically racist strategy to build wealth for white America. 2, it was backed by powerful government policies and funding. And 3, public housing was never designed for the poor. In fact, during the Depression, poor people couldn't even apply for public housing. It was originally designed for white middle-class, working-class families, and it wasn't until after World War II that the racial dynamic shifted to black people. This is where we left off. Without further ado, Richard Rothstein, please step to the mic and give him some more of that work.
The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans, and then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. At a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation. Of course, it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
Thank you, sisters and brothers, for giving me a nickel of your time. This has been 5 Minutes of Facts. We out.